title, Inspiring Sights, Yellowstone Through Artists' Eyes. Symposium that's part of a larger public educational outreach programming, Buffalo Bill Center of the West, celebrating the National Park Service's 100th anniversary. This event builds upon Peter Hassrick's pioneering book, Drawn to Yellowstone, Artists in America's First National Park, published back in 2002. This book, as you'll hear, has been revised and reissued by the Center of the West to coincide with the Park Service's 100th anniversary. And this afternoon, after we're done, we'll all have the opportunity to buy this book and have it autographed by the author. In a letter written on March 4th, 1917, an illustrated letter bearing the image of a bison bull eyeing a wolf on the fringe of a larger herd of bison. The author of the letter, C.M. Russell, declared or declined an invitation to visit Yellowstone National Park. He said, "I may visit at some other time, maybe next year. I would like to have one more look at a game country before they turn the park into a sheep range and the geysers into a steam laundry. There's an awful waste of hot water in Yellowstone Park, enough to wash inside and out all the reformers in the state. And there's a few of them. Thanking you, if I ever cross if you ever cross my range again, the latch string is out." Well, Charles M. Russell is not particularly known as an artist of Yellowstone. He's more known for his works created in Glacier National Park, where he had a cabin on Lake McDonald. However, he did make more than one sketching trip to Yellowstone National Park, and in 1915, the summer of 1915, Mammoth Hotel in the park accorded him a one-man show. So he was no stranger to Yellowstone. Bison figure into the topic of our first speaker today. He really needs no introduction, and he'll get precious little from me, except to say that he is a person that I admire very much. I admire his scholarship, I admire his administrative abilities and his leadership in the world of Western American art. He is a long-time curator and director, as you know, stops along his career trail at the Amon Carter Museum of Art, the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in those days, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, the Charles M. Russell Center for Study of Art of the American West at the University of Oklahoma, the Denver Museum of Art. Couldn't hold a job. Actually, he held jobs very well, and the legacy that he leaves in all of those institutions is one that anyone could be proud of. Like a homing pigeon, however, he has returned here to Cody in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, where he's Director Emeritus. Today he's going to be speaking on America's most famous 19th century landscape painter of the West, Albert Bierstadt, who first visited the area in 1881. Peter took Bierstadt's trail early in his career. In 1972, he curated the first major traveling exhibit of Bierstadt's work. He curated between 1976 and 1986 the 30 works of Bierstadt that are in the Whitney Gallery of Western Art here at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. And today he's going to talk about Albert Bierstadt's Last of the Buffalo. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Hassrick.
Can we turn the light down here? Oh, you got it. Look at you.
How is the sound, everyone? Do we need it up a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Up a little bit.
Up a little bit. Work on that. I'm the guy who just came down the hall. I didn't have to suffer the vicissitudes of America's air service, Joni. But it's great to be here at this podium, and it's an honor to be part of this esteemed group, and it's a great privilege to acknowledge the importance in our lives and in American history of Yellowstone National Park, and how important, in my estimation, the role of artists was in forming that park. Photographers too, we'll acknowledge that a little later, and scientists, but that we're going to try to bring some subjects to the fore here that maybe haven't been considered by everybody, and the first one is the idea that was put forward by a Montana historian by the name of Michael Punk. Now, he's the fellow who wrote The Revenant. Has everybody seen the movie? Or read the book, or whatever. But at any rate, he wrote a book called The Last Stand in 2007 for the Smithsonian. It was about the extinction or near extinction of the bison in Yellowstone Park. And who was it that saved Yellowstone Park? And he starts in the preface of his book, The Last Stand, with the comment that the story of how the buffalo was saved from extinction in North America is one of the great dramas of the Old West. And more profoundly, it's the story of the transition from the Old West to the New. So what happens once you save a species like this, and what happened at that juncture in our history in the late 80s, early 90s, in terms of conservation ethic and in terms of the sort of American mentality about how to deal with natural resources, is a very important moment in our history. And Bierstadt is, in my estimation, part of that switch. And this painting that we're looking at here is part of that, an important part of that story. Now Punk, because he's writing a book about George Bird Grinnell, who we'll meet later, gives credit mostly to Mr. Grinnell, and he doesn't even mention poor Mr. Bierstadt. So I'm here to add a chapter to his book. And it's actually, part of what I say is part of a new preface in the Drawn to Yellowstone book that we'll be seeing later. So I'm purporting that American artists, and particularly Albert Bierstadt in this painting, The Last of the Buffalo. Now there are actually two versions of it, one in Cody here that you see on the screen, one at the National Gallery of Art, which used to belong to the Corcoran Gallery of Art, is a second version, slightly bigger in size, maybe 8 inches on each dimension, but they're basically twin pictures. Those two pictures and how those pictures relate to this story of extinction and the saving of the bison in Yellowstone. So I'm also suggesting that Mr. Bierstadt, we think of Bierstadt as a painter of these grand panoramic landscapes, but Yosemite and the Rocky Mountains and the Wind River Mountains, and we forget that when he starts his career, he's really has a sort of combination of energies going. One is signified in this little sketch that's owned by the Autry Museum. It was painted in 1859. That the other reason for him coming west, not just to paint mountains, was to paint Indians and American Indian life and the bison. And that the bison and the Indian were synonymous, that they were intertwined in his mind and in his early efforts. And we'll see why that slipped away eventually, and we'll see what the impact of it when he comes back to it in that last consequential masterpiece, The Last of the Buffalo. It's also the story of a couple of other artists. I would say a handful of artists, but there's not even a handful. There are two of them. George Catlin on the left in the 1830s, who went up the Missouri River, painted Indians and buffalo. We'll talk a little bit about him. And somebody you may or may not know, William Jacob Hayes, a fellow New York painter. All three of these guys are New York painters, but a contemporary of Bierstadt's, who lived and painted animal subjects in New York. It's also the story of a sort of a summative gesture to all the branches of this museum. And I'm not going to read them off here. I just hate it when speakers turn around and read their PowerPoints. But if you look at these and you use a little creativity, you can probably identify most every element of the museum here in one of those lines. And I'll leave that to you. We can come back to that later. There'll be a little quiz. Yeah, one of those, wildlife conservation, isn't here anymore. I guess the Boone and Crockett Club took their display and ran off with it. But it used to be here, and we were proud to have it. So the story starts in 1833. George Catlin has just come off of the Missouri River. He's been there for a whole long, extended summer. He's hanging out in Cincinnati. He's finishing up some of the works that he'd done on the upper Missouri, and he's beginning to write his journals, transcribe his journals into what will become books in the early 1840s. He'd gone west, as we know, from St. Louis to the conjunction of the Missouri and the Yellowstone River, which is basically the North Dakota-Montana line. Fort Union, it was called. And so he paints the Indians. He's gone to paint portraits of famous Indians like Matatope, the great Mandan chief. He paints 200 or 300 portraits like this. But in the course of painting pictures like that, he also falls in love with the landscape and with the qualities and the uniqueness of American Indian Plains Indian life. And so he paints a couple of hundred other pictures incorporating those. And he paints this scenes of the innumerable buffalo. Probably in that day there were maybe 20 million buffalo on the northern and southern plains. There are all kinds of statistics, but that's my guess, and we can argue about that later. And then he paints this picture. It's in focus. I love it. And Bernard DeVoto, the great historian from Harvard, Western historian from Harvard, said this painting was the exemplar of all buffalo paintings, and all other artists following Mr. Catlin painted from this great picture. And it is majestic, and it is it has a presence, an imperial kind of presence, doesn't it? But there's also something about it that's very unique, or two things. One is he's looking at you. He's looking at you, the viewer. And the second is that he looks vulnerable. The expression on his face is not one of assurance, not one of command, but one of vulnerability. And Catlin thought that the buffalo, along with the Indian, were soon to disappear. The Indian depended on the buffalo for their culture and their life. Were about to disappear. But rather than paint a great painting about a lament about the buffalo and the Indian disappearing, he has a solution. And some of his writings that he starts putting together in 1833 contain that solution, and that is to establish a grand national park in the whole American West as a grand national park where the Indian and the buffalo can live together in peace and harmony, in what he says, in all the wild and freshness of their nature's beauty, end quote. Well, that was a great sweeping command, wasn't it? And nobody paid attention to it. It was so out of sight that nobody cared. But it was a genuine expression on his part. And then it was very different, too, in a way, from all the other artists who did follow, unlike what DeVoto was kind of suggesting. That same year, 1833, Carl Bodmer and Prince Maximilian are up the Missouri River painting Indians and painting buffalo, and this is a picture of Bodmer's of buffalo. And they're sort of in a romantic setting, but there's no connection there besides, oh, isn't this a pretty picture? Kind of a response to this work, and aren't these exotic animals? But that's not the same kind of commanding interrelationship that Catlin had established with his bison bull. And 10 years later, the great John James Snooty Audubon goes up the Missouri River to Fort Union also, He and his cronies shoot a handful of buffalo. They get skinned. He sketches the heads. The skins go back down the river, go up the Hudson River to his studio. They're propped up on 2x4 armatures, and he paints this very unsuccessful portrayal of buffalo. 10 years after that, 1853, the great Currier and Ives artist by the name of Arthur Fitzwilliam Tate paints sportsmen hunting buffalo. They're targets. There's no relationship beyond sort of amusement in this painting. And then Mr. Grumpy Face. His name is Beard, William Holbrook Beard. And Beard has a studio next to Bierstadt's in New York. In 1866, after the Civil War, he goes to Colorado and he paints this scene, which is very similar to the Bodmer scene. It's very romanticized. And one of the things that we don't see so much in these other artists, Tate or Audubon or Beard, there are no Indians. There's no interest in Indians. In fact, this guy, this is 1866, thanks to a certain Sand Creek massacre. There are a few Indians of the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes who don't really like guys like Beard hanging around, and he's very nervous about losing that beautiful head of hair. But there is one artist who, at least in terms of the buffalo, has the same kind of empathy, same kind of sympathy with the buffalo, and that's William Jacob Hayes. And Hayes has a studio next to Bierstadt's also. He has it on the second floor. Bierstadt's on the first floor of the 10th Street studio building that you can see here. He too goes up the Missouri River a couple thousand miles to Fort Union and paints buffalo as he goes. You can see him in his studio on the left-hand side, welcoming people to a reception in his studio. And when he comes back, he starts painting a series of paintings that are very telling in terms of this connection that Catlin had with the buffalo and that artists after him might emulate. And that is, this is a painting called Herd on the Move. It's at the Gilcrease Museum. It was painted in about 1861, the next year. And you can see a herd of buffalo. They're countless in number, and they're coming off of the bluffs here. But one has stopped and looks at a skull, his Hamlet moment, and questions his future, and then if you look closely, and I don't know if you can tell, but the buffalo in the front are looking out at us as if trying to get our attention. It's called an artistic device called the returned gaze. It was very popular in the 19th century, particularly by Manet. Have you seen his painting of the Olympia? Painted the same year as this, actually. Olympia lying naked with just a little collar, looking out at us and imploring our empathy and surprise. The second painting he does a year later, simply called Buffalo Crossing the Missouri River. It's a very different theme. It's a theme of nurturing and of birth. The herds of buffalo, you can see them in the background, coming down to the river, coming up onto the grassy hillside. The sun is coming up. This is a birth and regeneration kind of scene. And then a third one in the series, the Stampede, which belongs to the Glenbow Museum, shows a dusty, dry prairie and the buffalo stampeding and falling to their death over a ravine. Now, this guy was not a natural science painter. These are not documents of natural history. These are morality statements. And to show that they were a morality statement, and I learned this from Joni Kinsey, our next speaker, they were hung as a triptych. They were intended to hang as a triptych, the most sacred of the artistic dispositions that works could be presented in. Regeneration on the left, concern about the future in the middle, death and demise on the right. So these are powerful images telling us about the fact that these animals may not have a long time to survive. And in fact, he starts writing articles for learned magazines, including the American Naturalist, which was published by the American Museum of Natural History in 1871, saying that they're doomed. And he goes on a lecture series and has lantern slides and talks about the peril that is impending on the American buffalo herds. But like Catlin, no one listens. He paints this picture, which is a summative kind of version of the same thing. The mist is uncertain. The bull in profile is calling out for our attention. The one facing us is calling out for us to respond and empathize and acknowledge his presence, because it's getting late. It turns out, of course, that progress, it seems, is totally irrepressible. The mechanical age was upon us, and American entrepreneurial and imperial zeal, spelled G-R-E-E-D, was ascendant. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, the greatest engineering feat of the 19th century, but it cut the bison herds right in half and began the deterioration and decimation of the herds just by its presence. It took guys like this, Buffalo Bill, to feed the crews that built the railroad. And so when he enacts his buffalo hunts in his Wild West shows in subsequent years, it is the buffalo hunter in service to manifest destiny, in service to progress, not in service to them as animals that we should appreciate, nor of what they mean to Native people. And then, if you like this, even before the railroad was completed, trains took trigger-happy tourists onto the plains to amuse themselves in mindless slaughter. Can you imagine the letter that the guy writes home after shooting a buffalo calf with his Colt revolver? Dear Eleanor, I've had the most exciting day. Blah, blah, blah. At any rate, but the big move came in the early 1870s, and that was when buffalo hides were proved to be useful as mechanical belts for industrial purposes. Buffalo hunters, oops, got ahead of the game. Buffalo hunters came onto the prairie in the hundreds. They used their deadly sharp rifles to kill buffalo, skin them, ship them down the river. In a 2-year period, 1872 to 1874, in Dodge City, Kansas alone, as many as 850,000 buffalo hides were shipped from one town, from the southern herds. So that 20 million is going away pretty fast, and by the end of that decade, it had probably pretty much disappeared. American commerce could not be assuaged. Buffalo leather literally drove American and European, mostly German industry, and you can see the buffalo hide belts that are driving the machinery of American industry in this slide. There was another element in this story. It wasn't just for feeding industry and our ideas of manifest destiny. It was about what would happen to the Indians, and at this time, after the Civil War, we had a, quote, Indian problem, and they called upon William Tecumseh Sherman, who was known for his scorched earth strategy during the Civil War, successfully defeating the South, to do the same thing in the West with the American Indians. And after poor Mr. Custer's comeuppance, he assigned somebody named Nelson A. Miles to run things. And Nelson A. Miles and he promised President Grant that nothing whatsoever, nothing would impede the travel on the Transcontinental Railroad. Buffalo Indians, nothing would do it. They would see that that happened, and we would see that the Indians were put on the reserves. And there wasn't a formal policy by the federal government or by the military to diminish the herds, but the basic mentality was for every buffalo you killed an Indian. And so you could diminish the problem in increments like that. So Indians like Chief Joseph, for him, this was the final chapter. You see him surrendering in this Remington painting to General Miles, and the dead bodies of the horses and the Nez Perce Indians scattered around are reminiscent of the herds of buffalo that were scattered by the hide hunters, and it all culminated in the massacre of Wounded Knee in 1890 in amongst the Sioux in South Dakota. By the 1880s, it looked as though the buffalo, the Indians were being put onto their reservations. It looked like the buffalo would be extinct and eliminated from North America. And yet there was a very ironic and paradoxical call for help. And it came from this guy. And he said, the bison in Yellowstone Park are the only bison that are effectively alive. And we have to stop the poaching in the park, because poaching then, after they'd killed all the buffalo on the plains and the few had retreated to Yellowstone, they were being massacred by trophy hunters in the park. And Buffalo Bill writes a letter to the New York newspaper, said, gee, this is their final sanctuary. We've got to stop this slaughter in the park. Now, I don't know what his motivation was. It may have been that he was thinking of establishing a town called Cody, and he thought maybe tourists like you guys would want to go up in the park and see a buffalo. I don't know, but it's an odd defender of the buffalo, but he was there. The real defenders came in these two persons. One was Theodore Roosevelt, and one was George Bird Grinnell. Now, Grinnell was the editor of Field and Stream magazine, so he had quite a voice, a commanding voice, and his interest was in preserving. They were both very inveterate hunters, and they wanted to preserve wild populations so that there would be populations to hunt, but they also were conservationists. They wanted to be sure that these animals were preserved, that they didn't go extinct, and so they decided that they might establish the Boone and Crockett Club, and that was done a little later. These two guys had an effective voice, and they would have to, because by that time in North America there were probably 350 bison left, and 250 of them were in Yellowstone by 1885, 1886. Poachers. What were they poaching? Hides weren't that important anymore because there weren't enough of them to make an effect. They were poaching them for their heads. And they were sold so they could go to hang in saloons, and it cost them $500 to buy one. So there's the remnant herd in Yellowstone Park on the left. Ta-da-ta-da! Bierstadt arrives at the scene. So we step back a few years. 1881, Bierstadt comes to Yellowstone Park. He paints the falls, he paints the geysers, he paints big monumental pieces, remembering studio pieces when he gets back to his studio in New York. He too is, like Roosevelt and Grinnell, a great white hunter, and he, for example, illustrates a book by an Englishman of his sort of profligate hunting trip into the western part of Colorado, and paints the buffalo, this wonderful portrait of the buffalo, which this museum owns, but it looks kind of like one of those mounts, doesn't it? It looks like it's already a trophy, in a sense. And his elk that he paints for the same author in 1879 looks like it should have a target painted on its side. But his big moment, Bierstadt's big moment, came in 1880, the next year, when in Maine he was supposed to have shot a grand bull moose. And he liked this moose so much he painted 3 pictures of it, one of which the Wildlife Art Museum has a version of it. This one's at the Hagen Museum in California. It's an interesting story. He didn't actually shoot it. His guide shot it, but he took credit for it for quite a while. It was such a big rack that it went into the Natural History Museum in New York City and ultimately was given to the Boston Museum of Natural Science for their diorama on mooses. So Bierstadt's recognized as a hunter an avid hunter in the same way that Roosevelt and Grinnell are. And when they decide in 1887, this is the first meeting in January of 1888, the minutes from the first meeting of the Boone and Crockett Club, look at the second page. The guy at the top of the list of charter members is none other than Albert Bierstadt. And if you thumb through all the rest of the members that are charter members and get to the matter of business on the lower right-hand side of page 6, it says, our first matter of business as a club is to get governance for Yellowstone Park so that they will be able to prosecute the poachers. So Bierstadt's a member of this organization. Now put yourselves in his shoes. He's a Grand Manner landscape painter, loves Indians, and we'll find out why, loves the buffalo. What is he to do? He doesn't have a voice beyond his giant canvases, and so he decides he will paint not one but two huge versions of the last of the buffalo in tribute to them. He uses a sketch from the 1859 trip, his first trip into the West, and then he begins to build on that with oil studies, and ultimately ends up with the first of the two versions, the one that's in the Cody collection of the last of the buffalo. Now that particular version was shown up and down the East Coast in galleries, and then went off to London, where it was acquired by none other than Sir John Thomas North, the great nitrate king of England, who had a modest little estate in Kent called Avery Hill. And if you look really closely, you can see his painting in the back there. Can you see it? How many agree with me? One, yeah. It's kind of conjecture. But anyway, it ended up here. He paid $50,000 for it. So it was a big day for Al. The second version, the one from the National Gallery, was sent to Paris. And he thought it also had some showings on the East Coast. It went to Paris to be exhibited in the World's Fair, the Paris Universal Exposition, the year that they celebrated the opening of the Eiffel Tower. And there was an American pavilion of artworks, and he hoped to get his painting hung there, except for Mr. Fuzzyface here, J.G. Brown, who painted pictures of street urchins in New York, and said that Bierstadt's painting was not up to par. Bierstadt's painting was old-fashioned and not his best work, and we really can't consider it. Well, Bierstadt was a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, a title awarded him by the French king in the 1860s, and so he had the right to show any year he wanted one painting at the Salon, and into the Salon went his painting. Sorry about the fuzzy nature of this slide, it's the best one I could find. And so it was celebrated there, and also while it was in Paris, an engraving of it was made so that it could be consumed by people like you and me who can't afford $50,000 for a painting. Yeah, I shouldn't talk, I should look at my notes. Or maybe I should be like the musician, I should have a page turner. Mr. Hassrick, you're on page 6 now. So in context of the Buffalo Extinction, it needs to be remembered that this work for Bierstadt was a serious history painting. It was a scene that, if not set in Yellowstone Park in the Hayden Valley or the Lamar Valley, and there's a lot of conjecture because he made the mistake of saying it was painted in the Sweetwater River Valley in southern Wyoming with the Wind River Mountains in the background, but we think it's the Hayden Valley with Mount Washburn in the background. But even if it wasn't, because he'd been there, he knew what Yellowstone looked like, but even if it wasn't, it was inspired by the need in Yellowstone and the story that was evolving in Yellowstone as an allegory, as an elaborate metaphor for not only the end of the buffalo and the end of the American Indian, the Plains Indian, but also of the western frontier itself. He wrote, "I have endeavored to show the buffalo in all his aspects and depict the cruel slaughter of a noble animal now almost extinct. So that concept didn't fly. Oh, before we go to that, he used the same conventions that Hayes had used, that returned gaze, but look at who's returning the gaze to us now. It's the skull. The black orbs are looking out at us and saying, "You're too damn late. It's already happened." Well, back to the idea of this being a metaphor, an allegorical history painting. His first biographers, Gordon Hendricks, said that that's what it was. A number of other scholars said that, including J. Gray Sweeney, who's a revisionist art historian, and so I was kind of surprised at his assessment of it. But a number of other art historians have said, no, this is just a whitewash of history. That Bierstadt's trying to blame the Indian for the demise of the buffalo. And in his biographical account, he said that he should have blamed it on the hide hunters that you see depicted on the right by pictures by an artist illustrator by the name of James Moser. That's the accurate depiction, and that's what Bierstadt should have done. But that's not what Bierstadt was about. It's not who he was. It's not how he thought. He wasn't an illustrator. He wasn't into it for facts. He was into it for a major general kind of statement. So to understand why the assessment of the whitewash is incorrect, we have to understand a little bit about Bierstadt and his relationship to Indian people and to the buffalo, but mostly to Indian people. I said early on that he went west to paint Indian people as well as to paint majestic scenery. And so here's one of his first paintings. There you can see him painting it in his New Bedford studio, and there's not a single buffalo and there's not a single Indian. So what are you talking about, Hassrick? Well, I'm talking about the thing that's hanging behind him. It's a great Sioux exploit robe, buffalo robe. He'd brought those things back with him. These are sketches that he'd made along the way. Pioneers. There were 13,000 pioneers going west the summer that he went on the Oregon Trail with Lander to go to the Wind River Mountains, and so he passed a lot of pioneers on the way, pigs and chickens and cows and people, and some scenery, some places like you'd remember, like Chimney Rock. But when he gets down to painting pictures about his experience, he forgets the pioneers, and he paints Indians. He paints Sioux Indians in the foreground, and he eulogizes the Sioux Indians and celebrates their life in front of these majestic features. He does the same thing in this painting, a daytime scene of Indians moving, Sioux Indians moving. When he gets to the Wind River Mountains, which is his ultimate goal, there's a Temple Peak in the background, which is the subject of many of his grand landscape paintings. He paints the Shoshone Indians. He has seen 800 Shoshone Indians that summer, and he paints them, bands of them in front of the mountains. And when he paints his first major picture of a landscape nature, you notice this picture is 1/3 of it is Indian people in the composition. And in his grand magnum opus that's at the Metropolitan Museum, the Rocky Mountains, they're maybe 1/4 of it. You can see that he was trying to integrate Native people and their life ways into the grandeur of nature. They were inseparable in his mind, but not in the critic's mind. Now, there were a few critics who said, yes, it's effective, yes, it's interesting, but most of the critics followed a guy who wrote for the New York Round Table, and I'm talking about some major critics of the day. They mostly followed this guy who said, Bierstadt's subject was marred or is marred in its impression of solitary grandeur by the introduction of an Indian encampment. The artist has sacrificed sublimity for variety, and this is a serious aesthetic mistake. Get over it, Al. Get the Indians out of the picture. So pictures that you see subsequent to that in the 60s, like this. Not that there are a lot of Indians or buffalo in Yosemite, but they don't have any Indians in them. There are a few anomalies, like this wonderful picture of the buffalo hunt that was painted probably in mid-60s, 65, remembering the light and the color in Yosemite, maybe some of the forms in Yosemite, combining them with herds of buffalo that he'd seen in Wyoming. And so that's a remarkable kind of anomaly. But mostly in these ensuing years, he paints buffalo as surrogates for Indian people. The Buffalo Trail at the Boston Museum on the left shows a sort of a similar kind of a scene as the first, or that William Jacob Hayes painting of the buffalo crossing the river, being renourished. These are halcyon days of the buffalo. And then he paints the impending storm, a similar kind of scene, in 1869. What's happened in 1869? Something called the Transcontinental Railroad that we talked about. And so he sees the future. He sees their future demise impending. In 1876, to celebrate the centennial of the nation, he submits this painting, along with a number of others, to the Philadelphia Exposition, and it's called Western Kansas. And you can see it's sort of a eulogy to the buffalo. It's like they've already passed, the golden glow of yesterday. And to think, I don't think you can see it too well, but the opening pages of the catalog of the exposition, there's a sculpture by a British sculptor called America. And this thing, the thing right in the middle is a huge buffalo. If you compare him to the size of the people, this is one big buffalo. So somebody thought the buffalo was an icon of America, and we just killed them all. And what do we do with our icons? Well, you just let them go to hell. Maybe they all moved to England. Wouldn't that be nice? The painting that went to Paris. How are we doing on time? Ah, we're golden. The painting that went to Paris hung in the salon, and then it moved to a commercial gallery. When it hung in the salon, it attracted the attention of none other than the greatest animal painter in France at the time, Rosa Bonheur. And Rosa Bonheur's horse fair had in 1887, just 2 years earlier, been donated by none other than Cornelius Vanderbilt, somebody quite familiar in our parts, to the Metropolitan Museum. So she was a recognized figure both nationally in France and in America and elsewhere. She loved Buffalo Bill. She invited Buffalo Bill and his Indian troupe of Sioux Indians to Fontainebleau and painted them. Rocky Bear in the foreground in the green shirt and red shirt behind, two famous Indian leaders from the Sioux Nation who were with Buffalo Bill that year. And she painted Rocky Bear hunting a buffalo on his paint horse. Probably a scene that was set in the Wild West show, but she painted as an homage to Bierstadt and to Buffalo Bill. Obviously to Buffalo Bill, thanking him for giving him the subject, to Bierstadt because he'd loaned her 4 little paintings of prairie grass, because she didn't know what prairie grass looked like because she'd never been to America. And people would go and travel in the West, and they would send her dried grasses, and she couldn't tell anything from those. So it was Bierstadt's sketches that enabled her to paint a true picture of what the Western prairies looked like. So what's interesting then is that Rosa Bonheur caught on to the buffalo as portrayed by Bierstadt. When she paints the buffalo hunt, it's a painting and it's an expression of appreciation for cultural legacy for Native people and their ways of life. Contrast that to Buffalo Bill's portrayal of him hunting buffalo in service to progress and manifest destiny. And it's a pretty explicit kind of a contrast. And Rocky Bear, that old Sioux Indian, saw it that way too. You can see in this picture Rocky Bear and red shirt. Rocky Bear's taller than Buffalo Bill. a red shirt, and Rosa Bernur in the middle, seated here. When the salon quit, he took his painting and sent it to a commercial gallery in downtown Paris, Boussard, Valadon, and C. And you can see a picture of the gallery here. It was in the front window. And Rocky Bear and Red Shirt and some of their cronies heard about it and went downtown, took the tram, and saw the painting in the front window and said, "Oh my God, this is amazing." And they would do this every day. After the show was over, they'd go down there and stand in front of the window and look at this painting. And finally, it caught the attention of a reporter from the New York Times, a stringer who was in Paris to cover the event, and he interviewed Rocky Bear. And this is what Rocky Bear said. "Thank you, Mr. Bierstadt, for giving breath and life to the glorious past of the American Indian, and to the buffalo when the Indian was master of all he could survey." And the writer, the Times reporter, summarized that as a recognition of the truth of the painting, the truth of the scene, but also an eloquent allegory. He says, a testament to its sentiment and to its poetry. So that's how the picture ended up proving that it was not just an attempt to whitewash the end of the buffalo, but was really an expression of getting people's attention that this was happening, and it had virtually almost happened except for in Yellowstone Park. So we have a little postscript. His name is Frederick Remington, okay? Frederick Remington sent this painting to the same exposition, and it got accepted. It got a blue ribbon. It's called The Last Lull in the Fight. We don't know where the original is. It's probably somewhere in France still. But Remington saw the last of the buffalo. And we have a painting here in our collection called The Buffalo Hunt, which is obviously an homage to Bierstadt and his great canvas. And you notice in the foreground of the Remington that there is a dead Indian and a dead horse. If you look here, there's a dead Indian and a dead horse as well. He painted this scene also as a tribute to that. It's called Conjuring Back the Buffalo. And the skulls look out at us and tell us, again, just as Bierstadt's painting had, that it's a little late for paying attention here, but we want to rub it in your face. He did illustrations for an article on Buffalo Jones, who had a Kansas ranch that raised buffalo and interbred some of the buffalo with beef cattle. But he kept a purebred herd, and it was Buffalo Jones who ultimately saved the Yellowstone buffalo, because he brought some of his herd up to Yellowstone and some of the Pablo herd from Montana down, and the genetic diversity gave the herd enough to go on and to expand in subsequent years. But in 1890, when he paints these pictures and illustrates the story, the poachers are still virulently active in Yellowstone. And so Remington decides to go and take a look. And he goes out and joins Captain George Anderson, who happens to be also a Boone and Crockett member and superintendent of Yellowstone Park. And they ride out with Felix Burgess. You can see Felix, well, Anderson is on the white horse on the picture on the right. And Felix Burgess is looking for a ford where they can get across one of the rivers in Yellowstone on the left-hand side of that composition. And then he paints his portrait of Felix Burgess, the hero in Yellowstone of the bison story. Because it is in March of 1894, the following year, that they finally capture the major poacher. His name is Edgar Howell. And they bring him back to the headquarters of Yellowstone, but the laws don't allow him to put him in jail or to fine him. All they can say is, please, Mr. Howard, please leave our park and don't come back, please. And we're going to keep your gun too. So there was no force. in May of that year, this guy comes along and says to the Boone and Crockett Club members, we can do something. I have an idea. I'm going to push it through the House of Representatives. He's one of the representatives from Ohio, or Iowa. See, I should look at my notes. Don't tell him what fables I've told you today. And he pushed through the National Park Protection Act in May of 1894. And Grover Cleveland signed it, and it became law. And so he is a major factor in the story. And with that law, they could incarcerate people who poached. And it sort of put a squelch on it, and the herds began to revive. Today, there are 4,500 buffalo, too many for the park to even manage. So things went really well. But one final kind of a comment, and then if I have time for a quick postscript, almost, I had one more thing, but one more thought about Bierstadt, and that was, Bierstadt in 1889, his career had crumbled. He was having trouble. Guys like J.G. Brown were saying that he was old-fashioned, he was out of the picture, and so it's my opinion that this painting is also a statement by Bierstadt that no matter what they said back in 1863 about the Rocky Mountain picture and the Shoshone Indians portrayed there and the buffalo that they depended on, I'm going to make this my finale. I'm going to say, stuff it, critics. I'm going to paint the great Indian painting that's ever been painted in the greatest park that's ever been established. And so this is his sort of pent-up response to what had happened to his career. Not that he didn't succeed brilliantly as a landscapist, but that's just an idea. We can test that later in the Q&A period. So one quick final thing. Mr. Remington himself, the first director, brilliant director of the Whitney Gallery of Western Art, Harold McCracken, was given the assignment of curating and directing the first Whitney Gallery of Western Art. You can see what it looked like the day Harold walked in. Oh my God. Big empty room, 16,000 square feet of nothing. And by the time it opened, and Mr. Whitney, who had funded the building, came to the opening, it looked like this. And Mr. Whitney said, Harold, you're brilliant. I don't know how you did it. A lot of these things were borrowed from galleries, particularly the Knoedler Gallery in New York. And so he said, Harold, why don't we just walk around? The building cost $250,000 to build. And he said, I'll write another check for the same amount if you want to buy some of the art. And so that was the beginnings of the permanent collection, including the Last of the Buffalo that was there. And when the Last of the Buffalo came, it looked like this. There's something wrong. I couldn't figure it out until one day I looked really closely above the second skull on the left, and there was a patch. It looked like a patch. And so we had it x-rayed, and by golly, there was a patch. And it had been painted over at some conservation effort, and that buffalo had been removed. And so we were brave enough to have a conservator from Fort Worth paint it back in. And so the buffalo is now revived, the painting is complete, and the story is concluded. Thank you very much for listening.